This time on Poll Hub, it's Walz time. Kamala Harris has picked a running mate, and we've got a brand new poll with data about the Veep pick and some big changes in the race for the White House. And speaking of vice presidential candidates, J.D. Vance has made childless cat ladies one of the bigger trending topics over the past week. And it is true that Americans have been having fewer children with each passing year. So we decided to get away from the politics and the memes and look at what the data says. Our guest from Michigan State has some great insights. And finally, this week, there's no fun fact. It's replaced by kind of a happy, sad event. One of the Poll Hub team is moving on. The tears will flow. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho. I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Athen Hollis. I'm Delaney Hayes.
I'm Hunter Petro.
And I'm Lee Marengoff. Big ball club today.
Well, hi, everyone. And the speculation is over. Vice President Kamala Harris has made her pick for VP, and her running mate will be Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. It just so happens that we at the Marist Poll, along with our national polling partners, NPR and PBS News, have new numbers out on Walz as well as on the presidential contest, which we're now showing has Kamala Harris up 3 percentage points in the two-way matchup against former President Donald Trump. Lee, let's start off. What do you make of the Walz pick?
Well, I think it's an interesting pick, suffice it to say. And, he is a progressive from a governor from Minnesota. He's the only one of the 4 candidates who has served both in the House and in an executive capacity, now as governor, a House of Representatives and Congress, I should say, and now as governor of Minnesota. Kind of as people get to know him, and they don't currently, 71% in our last poll said they really don't know much about him at all, but that's going to change and probably is already. You're going to find him to kind of be a folksy, kind of like down-to-earth sort, not the slick, polished candidates that we might be accustomed to, but not shy by any stretch of the imagination. So I think he's being largely credited for coming up with the phrase weird to describe his opponents, and that sort of stuck. There's some controversy as to whether it's his phrase or not, but nonetheless, he will have lots more of that sort. So he's an unknown entity, but it's an interesting pick if you're interested in doing well, as the Democrats are, in the industrial Midwest. Someone from Minnesota, hopefully from the Democratic perspective, can do something about Michigan and Wisconsin and that big prize, which is Pennsylvania, which she decided not going with Governor Shapiro on that one.
I think that certainly the Democrats have been, looking at that blue wall in the Midwest that Trump certainly made them pay for in 2016. So that is something that has really lingered on their minds. I think Democrats have also had difficulty just speaking kind of in plain language, and they've certainly had a message problem. I would think just from the kind of the quick views that we've all taken, I think what the Democrats have found in him is someone who is not only very familiar with the issues and the issues that are important to Democrats, but one that is plain speaking about them. Certainly this all remains to be seen, but I don't think that Vice President Harris would take someone that she wasn't comfortable with. I mean, one of the things that she expressed along this decision-making path was that it had to be a good fit. It had to be someone she felt that she could work with. And look, vice presidential picks cause a lot of attention, as we all know, when they're being selected, but tend to, melt into the woodwork as we get closer to Election Day. And there is the decision for, president. The main thing is they don't want to be surprised that he has a few things that may be objectionable in his background, or that he goes out and, has some memorable lines or memorable moments, as Trump's pick in Mr. Vance certainly had over the first few weeks of his introduction to the American public.
Jay, I want to bring you in, but before I do that, I want to come back to the toss-up numbers that I briefly mentioned at the top of this segment. We were in the field just a couple days ago, and we found that Harris now receives the support of 51% of registered voters, including leaners, to 48% for President Trump. Now, we did polls shortly after President Biden made the decision to pull out of the contest, and at that point, we saw that Trump was plus 1 percentage points against Harris. So there is a shift, and we do see the vice president making making inroads with significant groups of the electorate, like independents, Black voters, white voters with college degree, women, and younger voters. She's also +3 in a multi-candidate field, which includes RFK Jr., Jill Stein, Cornel West, and Chase Oliver. What do you think, Jay, in terms of the shift in the electorate that we're seeing? Was that to be expected, given a little time after her announcement that she would be the presumptive nominee?
I guess it depends on, if she was going to be somebody who could enthuse Democrats, and she has. Actually, there's a couple numbers in here that I find really interesting more than the top line, because I think they speak to what's happening, which is a sense of excitement and passion in Democrats that was lacking. There was a resignation, and that's been replaced by what I think is very much like a 2008 style passion. Two numbers in particular. One is, we asked the question, regardless of who you support, who do you think is going to win? And in July, 39% of people thought Joe Biden was going to win, 59% thought Donald Trump's going to win. It's 48-48 now. Big jump. The other is in the economy. Who's going to handle the economy better? And this is something that has been really hard for Democrats. The economy is pretty close to the best we've ever seen in our lifetimes, unless you're, my age, Barb's age, or Lee's age. For everybody else, this is pretty much the best economy in our lifetimes. And the Democrats have really had trouble capitalizing on that, mainly because I think inflation is something people feel. In this poll, as president, who do you think would better handle the economy? Kamala Harris, 48-51. For Trump. I think that under the hood, when you're still asking the question, who are you going to vote for, there's still, I think, something catching up to do, even though in our poll, Harris is ahead. I think these underlying numbers speak to a more dramatic change, and I think that may get teased out by our poll and other polls as time goes on. Remember, we've got a week and a half now of crazy campaigning with the new vice presidential candidate. They're going to do all these rallies. It's going to be very exciting. They're going to suck up all the oxygen. Then there's the DNC, and then we get to Labor Day, and people start voting. This is actually coming down. We've been talking about how this is just going on forever. Oh, it's so long to November.
Well, it's the old Yogi Berra. It's getting later earlier. Mary, What do you got?
Thank you, Yogi.
Well, no, I was going to point out that, character has been such a huge point in this election cycle. And we asked what the most important candidate quality is. Barb, do you want to jump in terms of what we found?
Well, we put the usual suspects in our categories of choices. And the top was 27% of Americans want their candidate to be honest and trustworthy. And not surprisingly, that is the hope of many Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents, because Harris with that particular group of people outperforms Trump 75% to 23%. But coming in second was being a strong leader, which 1 in 5 Americans said was top of mind for them. And what we found there is that among those voters, Trump leads Harris 78% to 19%. So I think that we have very different perceptions of certainly each of the candidates, very different motivations. But I would agree also with Jay that what has happened is not just a change in the demography, but this change in really narrowing the gap on a number of important issues, whether that's the economy or the Middle East or the world stage. You have much more competitive notion. And that may simply be because Harris has not been defined by the Republicans at this point. She may have very, smooth sailing until Labor Day, when after the Democratic convention, kind of the attention from the Democrats moves on and the campaign really gets down and dirty.
I got a couple points I want to throw out to you guys. So, honest and trustworthy, that's Kamala Harris's strong suit. Leadership is Donald Trump's. In the next 70, 80 days, which one of those is easier to fix? I'm thinking it's hard to become honest and trustworthy if you're not seen that way. But I'm thinking that Kamala Harris might be able to cut into some of the leadership score that...
Well, if I might just jump in on that, Lee, I think it also can be a campaign ploy to undermine that. Kamala Harris has, certainly been in the public eye for quite some time, but as vice president. So there's a lot of people that don't know her. And so I think it's actually perhaps in the Republicans' favor that they may be able to define her as someone who perhaps is not so honest, not so trustworthy. And that is really a good portion of the foundation of her support.
And I want to throw one other point in here, and that's Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been a liability for the Democrats. His approval rating has been, exceptionally, exceedingly low. We saw his numbers go from the low 40s, his approval rating, to 46 right now, which suggests to me that getting out of the race and bringing home some hostages may actually have improved him. Now, do you think this is a long-standing momentum for him as he goes into the waning days of his term, or is this temporary, and does any of this convert into Harris at this point? That's all. That's my last question.
Oh, good heavens. Well, look, she's vice president. I think there's a whole long list of vice presidents who tried to become president by distancing themselves from the presidential administration to which they could not distance themselves. So, he's had a good run, but I think that still remains to be seen, especially if you frequent supermarkets on a regular basis.
So unless you've been living in a cave for the last few weeks, you've probably heard the term childless cat lady bandied about. Vice presidential candidate on the Republican side, J.D. Vance, made that term something that was very newsworthy. He has talked in a fairly negative way about not just childless cat ladies, but people who are childless in America as being somewhat of a problem. And in fact, his defenders have said, well, it is a problem. The birth rate is declining. The number of kids Americans are having is an actual issue, and it's something that needs to be discussed. And maybe he introduced the subject in an inartful way, but it is something we need to talk about. Right, Mary?
That's right, Jay. In 2023, the U.S. fertility rate reached a historic low, and it's not going away. It's a long-term trend. According to Pew Research, the share of U.S. adults under 50 without children who say they are unlikely to ever have children rose 10 percentage points between 2018 and 2023. That's an increase from 37% to 47%, and that's nearly half of Americans of childbearing age saying they're just not having kids. So why has the birth rate declined in the past years? Well, the top reason for those ages 50 and older is that it just didn't happen. The top answer from those younger, those under 50, was that they just don't want to have kids. Women under 50 are especially more likely to say that they just don't want to have children, 64% versus 50% of men in this group. Delaney, why don't you tell us a little bit more about why they're choosing not to have children?
Yeah, so in the same Pew Research study, they gave a list of reasons as to why people are choosing not to have kids. So the first reason was having time for hobbies and interests. And then the next was affording the things they want, saving for the future, being successful in their job or career, having an active social life. And those are the top reasons listed. And it's important to kind of mention the age divide. And a lot of the younger group listed a higher percentage of these reasons being the reason for not having kids. And there's also a gender divide in this category. Of those who said being successful in their job or career has been easier because they don't have children, it was 50% among women versus 39% among men. So despite nearly half of Americans under 50 saying they don't plan to have kids, there still is a stigma around that decision. Dr. Jennifer Watling Neal is a professor of psychology at Michigan State University and a part of the social personality program at the university. And she joins us today to discuss all of these numbers. So welcome and thank you for coming on today.
Thank you guys for having me.
So now that we've gone over all of this data, could you first start by giving us an overview of the historical trends in U.S. birth rates and how they've reached this historic low?
Yeah, well, and we've been seeing declines in the birth rate here in the U.S. for quite some time. And it's not as big as in some other countries. So in other countries like Japan, we're seeing much larger declines in the birth rate. But there has been, especially in recent years, pretty consistent declines in the birth rate. And I think people are now rightfully kind of looking at non-parents, as the Pew report did, to find out why that might be and what reasons people might be giving for not having children. And what we're seeing is that many people just don't want to have children. So in the Pew report that you guys referenced, and in prior Pew reports as well, that is the most common reason given for not having children.
You mentioned that the declining birth rate is not as great here in the United States as in other cultures, rather. Are cultural and societal expectations playing a role in decisions to not have children?
They are. I mean, I think that in some cultures, in the U.S. culture in particular, there are sort of strong pro-natalist norms where there's an expectation that people subscribe to a life script and they get married and have children, and that in some other countries, those norms might be stronger, and then in some countries, they might be less strong. So, but everywhere that we tend to see like prenatal norms. So it's just that they might be stronger in some places versus others.
And is there some validity, though, to this notion that some have talked about the concern for there being the lower birth rate is that if you don't have enough kids to replace the adults, that your society can really fall apart because there's not enough people to support all the old people, and the boomers are aging out and we're all living longer. And I mean, is there some basis in that, or is that kind of just a myth that people get scared about?
We do need people to kind of have an economy to support people in old age. But having more children may not always be the answer. So there's other ways to potentially grow a population, things like immigration. So I think that the concern is maybe a little bit overhyped. Maybe we need to think about that we can't just have unsustainable population growth either. We may need to kind of find other ways to kind of support the economy and support people in their old age rather than just relying solely on always having increasing birth rates.
So kind of back to the childless cat lady notion, I see you've done some research on the stereotypes around child-free adults, as well as attitudes that parents have towards child-free adults. Could you speak a bit more onto what you found and what attitudes are involved in that world?
Yeah, so there are a lot of common attitudes towards people that don't have kids and stereotypes. And oftentimes women are sort of subjected to these stereotypes a little bit more than men. So things that you might commonly hear people say of people who don't have kids is that they're selfish and self-centered, that they're focused on their career, so they're careerist. Some people will say they have no responsibility. Sometimes you'll hear, oh, they have tons of money. Sometimes you'll hear they hate children or that they'll regret their decision later. And J.D. Vance, who you spoke about in the intro to your segment, also said that people without children don't have a stake in the future. Right. So these are common stereotypes that we hear often. In a paper that we wrote, we found that people without a college degree and people who have or want to have children oftentimes hold more negative views of child-free people. So tend to be more likely to hold these stereotypes than people who don't have kids. And there's not really an indication for many of these stereotypes that there's actually any basis in fact for them. So in some of our research, for example, we found that among older child-free people, they don't regret their decision. Child-free people are often not more wealthy than parents. There's not an indication that they hate children. So a lot of these stereotypes are pretty unfounded.
When you think about the comments that Mr. Vance made, I'm thinking about, we're talking about the decision not to have children, but when you think about America's youth and adolescents, and they hear comments like this, when you hone in on developmental psychology, for an adolescent who may be like, okay, when I think about growing up, I don't want to have kids. What impact does that have on that individual as they mature? And how does that impact their self-esteem?
Yeah, well, that could definitely be stigmatizing. And we found in our research that many people make the decision that they don't want to have children pretty early in life. So the majority of child-free people that we have surveyed said they're typically making that decision in their teens or 20s. And so oftentimes people know very early on. And when people make comments and stigmatize them, it could be very othering and suggest, maybe there's something wrong with me because I don't feel like I want to have kids. Right? So these are things that could be, developmentally not great to kind of stigmatize people that have made that decision for themselves.
There's, as you mentioned, this is not new or unique to the United States. Every Western nation, actually throughout history, it's like the more economic benefit there is, the richer countries get, the lower the birth rate. And there's lots of rational reasons behind that. I'm just wondering, are there policies or anything that you've seen that have changed that trajectory a little bit? Because we do hear, so Republicans talk about, we need to have more kids. Democrats say, well, that's great, but you got to have, more child care. You've got to have more support for families. And it becomes this kind of back and forth political argument. But are there actually practical things that have been done or can be done to encourage people who want to have kids?
Yeah, and I do think that family-friendly policies are important for people who might want to have kids, but that might experience barriers to having them. So, for example, you mentioned childcare can be very expensive. And so having policies in place like, childcare and those kinds of things, I think would be, really useful for being more family-friendly. I think what doesn't work is restricting people's reproductive freedoms, right? Which is another thing that people oftentimes do, thinking that will raise the birth rate.
So to kind of wrap up, is there anything else you think that we need to add to this discussion, or any big piece of research we're missing on discussing this topic?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I would point out in doing research, a lot of my research hasn't focused specifically on the birth rate. It's more focused on trying to understand the characteristics and prevalence of child-free people. And in particular, we've looked at Michigan. But when we do that, child-free people look pretty similar to parents in most respects, right? So they're really similar in terms of income. They're really similar in terms of education. They're similar in terms of politics. They tend to be slightly more liberal, but not a ton more liberal, right? And they are very similar in life satisfaction. So oftentimes people kind of frame people who don't have kids and don't want to have kids as strange. And generally, they look a lot like anybody else. So I guess that would be something I'd want to point out to folks, that you probably have a neighbor that's child-free. You probably know somebody in your community that's child-free. People oftentimes aren't open about it because of the stigma that they face, but they're fairly normal folks.
So to use the phrase that is currently very common and popular, they're not weird, is what you're saying.
Yeah, they're not weird. So they definitely aren't weird. Child-free people are very normal.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate your time and expertise on the topic, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so this is, as Jay indicated in the beginning, this is not fun fact time. This is, well, I don't say goodbye Delaney, but it is, she's off to law school.
Well, that's what it is.
No, I don't buy the fact that we're never going to hear from her. We're never going to see her.
But it is goodbye
she's
for
gonna
now.
Be going from upstate New York down to St. John's. She's going to pass by. She's going to want to stop for a sandwich for lunch, and then we're going to see her then. Delaney, what's going on with you?
Sounds about
Are you stressed? Right. Are you calm? Are you happy? Are you eager? What's going on?
I think I'm feeling all the feels. I'm sad that I won't be returning to Marist. I think when I see some of my friends who are younger than me heading back to school, I'm going to feel a little emotional. Like Hunter, I'll see him enjoying Marist for the first time. But I'm definitely excited for this next chapter. I'm nervous, but I feel prepared and I feel ready to get to work. I had a nice restful summer and I got to work here with you guys, which was great. So I'm feeling ready to go.
Well, cool. Do you have a favorite Pole Hub memory that you will be taking with you?
I feel like I always say this, but my favorite Pole Hub memory was probably from last summer. And I see people nodding their heads and, it's probably the Barbie segment. That was one of the coolest things I got to ever do for any job. I mean, first of all, part of that assignment was going to watch the movie Barbie. So, it doesn't get better than that. And then I got to do a segment about it. And I actually, for my personal statement for law school, I don't know if you guys know about this, but I wrote about that segment in my personal statement for law school.
It worked.
And woo! Yeah, so I wrote about it in the fact that I feel that in that segment and with that theme in that movie, it gave a voice to the voiceless for a long time coming. And that's something that I hope to do with my legal career. So I kind of tied it into that. So it worked splendidly. And then a highlight from this summer was, I think, talking to sports law attorney Luke Fedlam about the recent changes in the NCAA. So that was great. The list could go on. I'm babbling now. So.
We have a lot of students who some of them kind of jump out, come up, and we spot them, and they're, we recognize, boy, this is someone who can go far and all that. Well, in your case, I think the first time attention to your talents was brought to my attention was by Mary, because we had you in class. Mary, what did you see in this younger version of Delaney that jumped out at you?
Well, let's just be clear. Delaney is still very young. Okay. But no, there was just a professionalism, as I shared with Delaney earlier today, your intellect, your enthusiasm, and, your astuteness, and to be able to comment in class and then to come into the office and to put these segments together that, as Jay has pointed out, and I completely agree with it, you have the ability that not everyone has to be able to identify newsworthy segments that are interesting and that can really take the data to a different level. And so I will greatly miss you. I'll miss having you in class as well as here on the podcast. But I know this is not goodbye with you. There will always be a ride to campus because I'm not too far from St. John. So if you ever need anything, just give a holler.
There's food everywhere. Jay, you've worked with all of our student producers closely. Anything about the person before we get, like in a couple of weeks, I think we get another exit to discuss. I mean, this is going to be rough around the edges, but we got Delaney today. What's your take on this moment in our history?
So, yeah, I think, a lot of our audience has been listening a long time. This is episode 357. Is that right, guys? Yeah, 357. We've been doing this for almost 8 years, and students were always involved at the beginning in somewhat peripheral ways as we got going. Last summer, Delaney and Athen, you were in a Tarver scholarship, right? So you were away for part of the summer. Delaney and two others basically changed the path of Poll Hub and it happened with our 300th episode about music, right? Which Athen, you were part of too. And that let us finally say, you know what? The students don't need to be on the periphery. They can do this. If we can do it, they can do it. And Delaney, you helped prove that. And coming back this summer, Hunter, who's brand new, just started, is already doing segments, is already producing segments, is on, the air with segments. And you guys are doing amazing work. And I don't say that because, I'm buttering you up. These are totally professional segments that you guys do. You're in them, you're putting them together, you're doing the interviews, you're doing the work. You could turn around and be on an NPR podcast tomorrow, and you would be just as good as anybody on those. And Delaney, to your credit, Athen's been with us for a long time. She's been through this process a long time. You came last summer and jumped in, and you came back this summer and we're raring to go. And kudos to you. You're a total pro. And you're going to be a great lawyer. I may need you. We'll see, depending on what type of law you practice. But I'm going to keep you in my...
No criminal law.
Oh, no criminal.
Well, hopefully you won't need me.
Hopefully I won't need you for those reasons. But we need lawyers for many reasons. So I'm going to keep you in my contacts list. If for no other reason than future legal
and Hunter,
help.
Anything on role models of these other characters? I assume you've absorbed an awful lot in a short time.
I feel like I'm not even going to say... I don't feel the need to say bye because I'm going to be harassing Delaney and Athen both with an overwhelming amount of messages over the next few weeks as I come onto campus for the first time, because I don't even know where to get food. So they can very much expect to hear from me a lot.
And just to remind everybody, you weren't on campus here in Poughkeepsie because you were on Marist campus someplace else.
Yeah, I was on the Marist campus over in Ireland for my first year.
So Athen, Delaney's on her way, and we'll just spoil it for everybody. We're doing this for you in 2 weeks. What do you think?
I wouldn't say this is goodbye either. I mean, Delaney's going to be hearing from me because I'm going to be doing the same thing she's doing, but just at a delayed timeline. So going to have a lot of law school questions. So it won't be goodbye forever.
Oh, that's great. I love the support. Well, I think we can only honor Delaney's exit by letting you say something about, and that wraps up this segment of You get to close us out. I don't give that up easily.
Oh,
I don't give it up at all usually.
I wasn't prepared for this.
It's a wrap.
Well, Lee's not prepared for this usually either, so nothing's really changed.
So thanks to all of you, first of all, for everything you've done for me and for allowing me to be part of the team. I've had a blast. And I will definitely stay in touch, as I'll be just down the road in Queens. And that's it for this episode at Poll Hub. See you next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis, Delaney Hayes, and Hunter Petro.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
And finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you
in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.